Hey guys, today we're going to focus on some of the basic ideas and concepts of government. We're also going to address 5 basic questions. First one is, why do we have governments?
What is a sovereign state?
Who rules a government?
What is the importance of civic virtue?
And finally, why should government power be limited?
One of the first concepts we had throughout the year was this idea that if there was no rules, no laws, no government, if we were living on a desert island, what would happen if there was no authority whatsoever? We came to the conclusion that it would definitely be difficult. People would probably fight each other. People might be naturally selfish, want to look out for themselves. And in Thomas Hobbes' view, he would call that a state of nature. No government, people are constantly going to be fighting, really brings out the worst in people.
Okay, Hobbes also was one of the first to come up with this concept of a social contract. And basically what he thought is that people give up rights and power to the government, and in exchange for that, the government would provide protection, and they would protect against this constant warfare that typically happens in a state of nature.
One of the first images we looked at throughout the year was this book cover called Leviathan. And we did a primary source activity, looking at the cover, trying to figure out what Hobbes wanted to communicate to people who read this book. And his argument in the book is that if you have a strong ruler, a powerful ruler, as the illustration shows, that's the only person that can prevent warfare. That's the only person that creates order and stability in society. So, people are going to agree to have this government, but once you have it, that's it. Strong ruler lays down the law, and you can't change it.
Okay, one of the other philosophers we discussed was John Locke. And one of his ideas was the concept of the tabula rasa. And that means that the mind is a blank state, and that at birth you basically fill your life with certain experiences, and those experiences shape who you are as an individual. But he also thought that we share a human nature that is the same for everyone, and this laid the foundation for his later concept of natural rights theory.
Locke has a different view. He thought, look, people when they're born, they have certain things. And those can be life, liberty, and property. We're all born with these. You don't buy them somewhere. Everyone has these rights, he believes, and government plays a role in that.
Okay, and government's role, according to Locke, is not just to keep order, but it's also to protect natural rights. And this is where he deviates a bit from Hobbes, is that where Hobbes was more concerned about control and order, Locke was more concerned with the idea of government protecting those natural rights of life, liberty, and property.
Also in Locke's idea, if we're going to enter into this social contract, we're giving up absolute freedom to do whatever we want, but that's because we all share this idea that we want our rights protected, and the government's role is to protect those natural rights.
The second part of his social contract theory is the idea that if the government fails to protect your rights, you have the right to revolt. Okay, now in an undemocratic system, that would actually mean a violent revolt against or a takeover of government. However, in a modern system of democracy, the right to revolt is translated into voting, and then just voting elected officials out of office, and then redoing that social contract with new representatives.
Our next section of Unit 1 involved this idea of a sovereign state. And when we went through our reading there, we found that a sovereign state has 4 components: population, territory, sovereignty, and government, and we'll get into those.
Okay, so when you mention a state, do you mean like Connecticut or Rhode Island?
No, even though that's what we think of normally here living in the U.S., in a global sense, we're thinking more of a country almost. So the word state and country sort of used interchangeably here. So in our case, in a government class, when we say state for this purpose, we're referring to really a country.
Okay, so not a state like the United States, like the 50, just a state as in a nation state, a country.
Correct.
Okay. Okay, one of the first elements of a state or a sovereign state is that it has a population. And this is defined by a group of people who have membership or their members are citizens of a state.
Territory, it's going to be those land areas with set boundaries in which a state's rule applies. We all are familiar with the boundaries of the United States. Other states around the world have very similar geographic boundaries, whether it's rivers, oceans, up next to other countries. We know what a territory is.
Okay. What if there's a dispute over the territory? Is it still a state?
Yeah, well, sometimes we see that carried out through various wars or conflicts. Sometimes people may have conflict over natural resources. If there's a territory dispute, for example, take like with the Crimea region of Ukraine, that played out where Russia actually took that over. So that's no longer part of Ukraine. We'll see if anything else comes of that. And,
So territories can change and shift all the time.
they can change. They're not set in stone forever. Clearly, the territory of the U.S., when you take U.S. history, expanded from the original 13 all the way to the 50 states today. So.
Okay, the third element is sovereignty. And sovereignty means the ability to rule absolutely within a territory. And to simplify that, that just means that no one else outside of your country can tell you how to run your own. A lot of times they try to. The U.S. is a culprit of that, trying to make other countries do certain things. But for the most part, if you have a sovereign state, the government of your country is the one who makes the rules. No outside force can dictate the inner workings of your country.
The government itself, civics is a citizenship and government class, but what exactly does it mean to have a government? We're going to take a look at the 4 roles that government has, but really it's that organization inside the state that's going to control basically what happens inside your state.
Yeah, the 4 roles of a government, or any government, are: the first is to make laws. Second is to protect the state. Okay, that means to protect it from foreign countries and invasions. The third is to keep order, and that is similar to protecting the state, but that's within the country. So how do you keep security and order within your nation state's boundaries? And then lastly, provide services such as schools, hospitals, transportation. So those are the 4 things that just about every government does in order to be considered a government.
To try to bring this into some current events, when we looked at what's happening in Iraq and Syria right now, the question we asked all of you is the Iraqi government fulfilling those 4 main roles? And you had to take a look at the evidence that was there, look at the situation with ISIS, and come to the conclusion, are they fulfilling the roles of government?
No.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
they are not. Particularly in northern Iraq, they
No.
cannot satisfy all of these things. So hopefully, from the U.S. perspective, they can gain control over that. But as of now, they are simply not a functioning government in the northern part of the country.
Our next section involves who rules, and this took a look at a number of different types of governments that we have around the world. And one of the first ones that we looked at is any form of government with a single ruler would classify as an autocracy. Now that's going to be divided into 2 main types, where one person has all the power, with a monarchy and a dictatorship.
Okay, let's start with monarchy. That's the traditional king and queen ruling the country, and power is inherited through family line, typically the firstborn son. And a lot of the, if you've taken European history or just know about the kingdoms there, they started out as an absolute monarchy where the monarch would have complete control over the country. Since then, they still have monarchies in Europe, but they're constitutional monarchies, which means that the monarchs are still the head of state. They do a lot of the diplomacy and things like that. However, it's really more of a ceremonial position. There's still a constitution. They still have a republic. They vote for parliament and certain representatives, but there still are existing monarchies throughout the world.
Dictatorship is the one we're probably the most familiar with, certainly in a sense of former dictator Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Adolf Hitler, Bashar al-Assad of Syria. We hear that word dictatorship. One leader has absolute control over citizens' lives. The United States ousted Saddam Hussein several years ago when we invaded Iraq. People now are questioning, if you had to pick a poison, is it better to have a Hobbes viewpoint, to have someone like that in control? It's not the best, but it keeps stability in the region. Or what happens when you try to create a democratic government and you have different people competing?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, is it better to have a dysfunctional dictatorship that violates people's rights but keeps order versus a completely dysfunctional democracy that is closer to anarchy.
Right.
And really neither of them are good situations, but the goal is to try to get towards a more secure and orderly state without having to take away everyone's rights.
Absolutely.
And that's the goal of each government.
Yeah, we'll take a look at democracy now. Citizens hold the political power. Two types of democracy. We're going to have representative democracy and direct.
Okay, representative democracy is the type that we have at our federal level, our national level of government. In that type of democracy, people have the power, but people don't engage in the day-to-day running of government or decision-making. They elect representatives to do it for them. In a country of more than 300 million people, it would just literally be impossible for us to have a direct democracy on a large scale. So instead, what we do is we vote in elections to elect leaders that represent us.
The form of democracy that would probably work best in maybe smaller communities. We showed pictures of ancient Greece where you can have everyone directly participating in making the laws. Now, do we have forms of direct democracy today? Sure. At the state level, citizens can actually get enough signatures, and on a ballot, they can come up with their own initiatives where they can vote directly and make the laws directly. So we do see it today in various forms and in certain states around the United States.
Another example locally in the New England region, they have a lot of town meetings still
Yes.
that determine budgets and things like that. And every citizen in the town can go to the meeting and has their own particular vote. They don't have a representative at all. They vote themselves in those elections.
Correct.
Okay, an oligarchy is a small group that has all the power. An example of that would be a military junta, and that is where small groups of officers take over a government, overthrow the established regime, whether it be a dictatorship or a democracy or any other type of government, and then they control the country by brute force. They weren't elected, they didn't get it by family ties or heredity. They just take over the country with the military. Yeah, are there any examples of military juntas today?
Well, usually we would see something like this in maybe Central Africa. We do see governments that have broken down, and as a result, it's honestly who has the most guns or who has experience in the military and is then taking that for their own personal gain, a group of military officers. I know in our reading they mentioned the country of Myanmar or Burma for a while had a military junta ruling the country. And you could even maybe make the argument South Africa, not a military junta, but certainly an oligarchy, where maybe one group, in the case of different races, having political power for a while during the apartheid era.
Okay, that's a good example. An oligarchy doesn't have to be a military junta. There's other types of small group rule throughout the world.
Okay, theocracy. This is where we involve religion with this type of government. Now, with that, we see mostly Islamic republics typically have theocracies, but just because if you have a theocracy, does that mean that you're a dictatorship or you're a monarchy or you're a democracy? Does it apply to all of them? Is it just one? Why don't we take a look at where theocracy actually applies?
Okay, well, one example would be, like you mentioned, Iran. And that is an example of, in a republic, they have elections and they have representatives, but they also have Islamic law. Okay, so they are a theocracy. God's law is actually translated into, their civilian law, but they still have elections and representatives. It's not a dictatorship or any type. But so just know that theocracies, that's where you have the infusion of religion and civilian life and government. Unlike in the United States, where we have a clear separation of church and state, which is debatable, which we'll get through later in the year. But for the most part, the United States separates church and state, meaning separates religion from government. Some countries do not.
Of course, very similar to a state of nature is anarchy. No government, no control, no one's in charge, complete chaos. There are no rules, no laws. Anarchy is just that. And if any of you watch that show, Sons of Anarchy, it's about a motorcycle gang that kind of goes around. So we do see the term now and then.
And as far as a country having anarchy as a government, it doesn't exist. Because remember, one of the four parts of a sovereign state is a government. So if there is no government, anarchy doesn't actually qualify as a sovereign state. The only time that you get anarchy is when a state literally breaks down. Like sometimes throughout the last 20 years, parts of Somalia have had no government control. It's been basically anarchy. in parts of northern Iraq and Syria. Once the Syrian regime fell, there's been anarchy in those places, and that's where groups such as ISIS and different al-Qaeda cells have been able to establish controls because there was no government functioning in those regions.
If you take a look at this chart here, who rules? This is pretty helpful. Just in the sense of organizing, how can we organize government and what are the different forms? So if you just take a look at this across, we just went through these various forms, but I think this is helpful in a visual sense where you may have no one ruling all the way along the spectrum to many people get to participate. Certainly the United States, we would fall onto the right side of that spectrum with a representative democracy and some components of direct democracy here and there.
Yeah, one thing to note is that the type of government that we left out there was the theocracy, and that's because theocracy could apply to any of these, except for anarchy. Okay, but we could have a theocracy that has one, few, or all. But just know that these are the main types of government that we see throughout the world today.
Our next section involves civic virtue and the common good. Two terms. We use a lot of paintings to try to illustrate these points. And for the common good, doing what's best for the community as a whole. We'll take a look at how these ideas are played out in some of the paintings that we looked at.
Okay, similar to common good, the concept of civic virtue, that means putting the common good or the good of the community, you're doing that, but you're also doing it above your own self-interest. So an example of that would be the basic idea of paying taxes. That money that you pay in taxes, you could use that to spend on anything you'd want. However, you pay your taxes because it's going to be dispersed and used for some type of government service or the common good, whether it be defense or other services like hospitals or roads. But there are other examples too that we'll go through throughout the year that demonstrate how you do things that maybe don't help you at the moment, but they will help you in the end, because as you help the common good through civic virtue and do some sacrifice, it will come around and help create a better community, which in turn makes your life better.
The story Cincinnatus, and we use this painting to show a citizen of Rome who was called upon by his country to help lead his country and be victorious against the enemy. Now, knowing what we know about human nature, most people, after being victorious and given an opportunity to take power or to be a leader or to have everything that you ever wanted, most of us or people out there, we would think, would take that opportunity. Cincinnatus fights for his country, defends Rome, and says, I'm going to go back. I'm going to retire, and I'm just going to go back to my farm. I did my duty. It's in the best interest of Rome as a whole for me to step back and let the government be. We use him as a case study because in a country like ours, or in any government, we would hope that the people who are in charge possess this degree of civic virtue.
Okay, we also brought up the concept of George Washington as an example of civic virtue. How did he demonstrate this concept throughout history?
Right, very similar. People call George Washington a modern-day Cincinnatus. And in fact, there's a society called the Society of the Cincinnati, which was formed with family members related to Revolutionary War generals. If you look it up, it's pretty interesting. But going back to Washington, after the Revolutionary War, he had an opportunity to pretty much do what he wanted, control the military, and throughout history, military people have gone on to seize power. Washington, as this painting shows, hands in his military commission and retires to his farm on Mount Vernon. It wouldn't be until years later where he would be called back to serve on behalf of his country and become our first president. But the King of England even said, George III, if what he has done is true, he'll be the greatest man who ever lived. And he does rank high among our presidents in U.S. history, and certainly a modern-day Cincinnatus indeed. And
he also, once he was president, he demonstrated this again. How did he do so at the end of his presidency?
You know, in the Constitution, it didn't say originally that you have to have only a maximum of 2 terms. Washington set the precedent. So after 2 terms, he said, you know what, I'm done, stepped down. Adams became the next president. But nowhere in the original Constitution did it say you had to only serve twice. Again, stepping down for the good of the country.
Okay, governments must be limited to prevent the possible abuse of power. And we do this because throughout history there's been countless examples of governments actually doing this and abusing power. So by the time the founders sat down during the convention to establish this, we had a lot of history and precedent set of people abusing it. So they specifically set up our Constitution to try to limit this possible abuse in the future.
Constitution. Well, what is it? We had our Constitution Day, and everyone got a pocket Constitution. It's a rule book. It's a framework, lays out what a country's government is.
Okay, so this rule book has a few different parts. So the Constitution limits governments because it says exactly what it does have the power to do. So it starts out by saying what type of government we're going to have, how it functions, how laws are made, as well as the rights and responsibilities of citizens. So all of these things, they seem like they're adding powers, but at the same time, they're also limiting it beyond the scope of those powers that are listed in the Constitution.
Another idea that we have of limiting government is with the rule of law. Look, not even the president, the leader of a country, our government officials, no one is above the law. And we have this concept because we have to create limitations, even on those who we elect to be in power. So it's enforced, it's fair, it applies to everyone.
Okay, a third concept of limiting government is the separation of powers. And that's the concept of taking different types of power and assigning it to different people in government. And our government divides it into three branches. We have a legislative, an executive, and a judicial. Some countries do it a little differently, but those are the three basic ways that most countries separate their powers. You have one group of people that enforce the laws, the executive, one group that makes the laws, the legislative, and then one group that interprets the laws, which in our case is the judicial system.
Consent of the governed pretty much means if you're going to enter into a social contract or you're going to agree to set up a government, you got to provide your consent. And how do we give our consent? Every 2 years, every 4 years, etc. Mostly through voting. Mm-hmm. Right? We provide our consent. We approve of who's in the government through voting. And even if we don't like the way something is set up, we can amend the Constitution. Mm-hmm. We can change laws, provide our consent that way. Mm-hmm. So voting is how we do that.
Good. And to provide an example of that, there's actually a ballot question coming up in my state of Rhode Island in which we're going to choose whether or not to have another constitutional convention in the state of Rhode Island to actually rewrite the state constitution, which is kind of wild to think of, but but on a local level, we may actually be making some changes to it, either amending it or just changing the text of the Constitution itself.
Wow.
Okay, rights of the minority. And this concept means that majority rule doesn't mean that you can abuse the rights of the minority. Okay, so say there's a small or unpopular group in society, just because they lose an election or they're on the other side of the democratic system, it doesn't mean that you can just do what you want to that group or completely ignore or violate their rights to life, liberty, and property. Thanks for watching this video about the basic ideas of government. I will be going over this in more detail throughout the year. And if you have any questions, please let us know in class. Send us an email, and we'll see you soon.